All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Shakupe. I'm the Global Technical Lead with the Early Childhood Development Action Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's webinar on realizing the right to early childhood education through courts and UN mechanisms. This is one of many webinars, part of a series that's part of the Harnessing Global Data for Young Children initiative. Harnessing global data for young children brings together researchers, policymakers, and implementers to leverage the power of global data to advance young children's learning and development. The project is funded by the UK Research and Innovations Economic and Social Research Council through the Global Grand Challenges Research Fund, and is led by Dr. Alan Stein at the University of Oxford and Dr. Linda Richter at the University of Witwatersrand. Since the initiative is interdisciplinary, please watch out for a series of webinars across multiple disciplinary perspectives. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to the chair of the webinar, Dr. Sandy Fredman, who's a professor of law at Oxford University and the director of the Oxford Human Rights Hub. And she's been leading the movement to develop an evidence base for early childhood care and education in international human rights law. So it's my pleasure, Sandy, and over to you.
Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's wonderful to see everybody here, and a big welcome also to our panel. So the focus of this webinar is on human rights law and how we can best mobilize human rights law at international and at domestic level to achieve early childhood education for all young children all over the world. So there's a huge amount of potential in human rights law, but it's only very recently that we've been recognizing this potential and working out ways in which this potential can best be realized. And for that reason, we've brought together this expert panel who are all really at the forefront of developing ways in which to mobilize human rights law to achieve the right to early childhood education and development. So the way in which human rights law at international level works is that there are a range of international human rights law instruments, which I imagine everybody's familiar with. And these are monitored by United Nations monitoring committees, which are made up of experts and have various processes, including that every country who has ratified the convention submits a report periodically every 4 to 5 years saying how they have fulfilled this convention. We have focused particularly on the right to education, which is found in at least 3 of the main international human rights conventions. But the difficulty is that the right to early childhood education is not expressly mentioned, whereas primary and secondary education is. So our very first challenge is to show that the right to education in these international human rights covenants also covers early childhood care and education. And we are particularly, as I said, focusing on interpreting the right to education at international level to do so. The only international covenant which does expressly mention early childhood education is the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So our first panelist, who's Georgie Donati, who's also on the international trial that Shikofi has mentioned, which I'm on too. And we have worked together on looking at the practice and the wording of international covenants to show the many ways in which it can be interpreted in order to include a right to early childhood care and education. And that will be our first paper, which will be from Georgie setting that out. We are hoping that our next panelist will join, who is from actually the committee, one of the committees itself, and can talk to us from the perspective of the committee. But if she doesn't join, we will move straight on to looking at how national human rights law at domestic level can be mobilized by bringing in Narina Ali, who has also been at the forefront, but at national level, of using courts and other means of advocacy to further the right to education. So she was previously the legal director of the Law Center of Equal Education, which is the foremost public interest litigation center in South Africa, and is now a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. And she will talk to us about strategic litigation, furthering the right to early childhood education in South Africa. A different tactic is to see whether and what opportunities there are for actually amending or changing the wording of international covenants so that we do have express reference to the right to early childhood education. And at the forefront of that has been Human Rights Watch, and particularly Bede Shepherd, who we are very lucky to have with us here too. He's the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch, and he's going to talk to us about ways in which we can further improve the reference to early childhood education expressly through international human rights covenants. And then, of course, none of these are mutually exclusive strategies. So Raji Mikosami, who is from the Right to Education Initiative, is going to talk to us about how the Right to Education Initiative is spearheading advocating at international level for a human rights approach to early childhood education. So that's our panel. I think we're all in for a very rich discussion. Please do put in your questions and answers into the Q&A. We will be monitoring them. And for the last half an hour of the session, we will convene as a panel in order to answer your questions. And I've also encouraged the panelists to bring in comments and questions themselves so that we can catalyze this discussion and continue it at the end. Each of our contributors is going to speak for 10 minutes. As I said, when I come back on, please know that you've got 1 minute left and start wrapping up. So we look forward to this discussion, and I hand over to Georgie Dunyati, who, as I've said, is a senior research fellow, a postdoctoral research fellow on the Global Data Project, who's going to talk to you about our paper. Over to you, Georgie.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Thanks for the introduction. Can I just check that you can see my screen? Okay. I'll assume yes. Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. So as Sandy said, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the right to early childhood care and education in international human rights law. And this is some work that we've been doing over the last couple of years together. So the right to education, as Sandy said, is enshrined in a number of widely ratified human rights conventions, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And these explicitly point to the right to primary and secondary education. However, it's kind of less explicit how the right to early childhood education and care fits into these. However, we've kind of been arguing that ECCE is actually implicitly included in the right to education, as well as the right to survival and development, through their emphasis on ensuring the development of the child to their fullest potential. As I'm sure everybody attending this webinar knows, how much evidence there is really to the importance of the early years in subsequent social, cognitive, and other aspects of child development. So as well as having these main conventions, the treaty bodies also make kind of clarifications, filling out the more general language of the conventions with more specific expectations. And both the CRC and the CRPD have general comments. These general comments which explicitly refer to ECCE as part of the right to education. The ICESCR, which is such a mouthful, also alludes to it in more general references to basic education. And this means that we're kind of interpreting that the monitoring bodies are implicitly also including ECCE as a right. As Sandy mentioned, there are then reports, which also countries fill in reports as to how they're doing in terms of fulfilling their obligations, and then the treaty bodies write reports back, these concluding observations, and telling them about how well they think they're complying to the conventions, and these are called concluding observations. And what we did is we analysed all of these reports from 2015 to 2020 for these 3 conventions that I've been talking about, to look to see the extent to which these monitoring bodies were actually including ECCE as a part of the expectations that countries were supposed to be fulfilling this. And we found that really the conventions were kind of holding countries to account on this. So you can see from the committee for the CRC sort of mentioned early childhood education, 79% of the reports for all countries across the world within this 5-year period. And they said things like, countries should invest in early childhood education and have a comprehensive and holistic policy of early childhood care and development for children under the ages of 3. So this is quite an extensive expectation. And this can be seen across the conventions. So if we take Slovakia, for example, each of the monitoring bodies within this 5-year period pointed to the need for support, investment, and equal access to ECCE. Across the reports, the bodies consistently required countries to provide affordable, accessible, quality ECCE backed up by adequate financial, technical, and human resources. And these needed to be fundamentally inclusive and non-discriminatory. They also found that the majority of states were not delivering on this obligation. So what was also clear from our analysis of these observations was that inequality of access was rife. And this graph shows the percentage of reports highlighting the lack of access for these different groups. So as you can see, those with disabilities, those in rural areas or in poverty, girls, ethnic minorities, those imprisoned with their mothers, refugee, migrant, and street children were amongst those. And private education is also sort of highlighting the barriers that a lot of people face because of the privatisation of ECCE. The committee's recommendations also consistently point towards a need to break kind of cyclical relationship between education and poverty by ensuring ECCE provision for poorer families. And this is true both in the global north and in the global south. So in the UK, for example, they say that many children living in poverty, particularly boys, do not meet the expected level of language development at preschool level. And this has a negative impact on their primary education, hindering their development throughout their life. So this really nicely encapsulates the earlier point about why ECCE is so fundamental to ensuring the full development of the child. In Ethiopia, they highlight regional disparities, which points to the kind of intersectional relationship between poverty in many countries and those living in rural areas or whatever the location. Child development is exacerbated by poverty, and yet it is those children who are least likely to receive ECCE. Another issue which is clear in the reports is a kind of intergenerational transmission of inequality through discrimination against women and girls. Girls often face challenges at school in the form of violence and then later pregnancy. This pregnancy often leads to girls leaving school, which then has a knock-on effect on their own child, because maternal education is one of the most reliable predictors of child development. And also they're likely to be the ones providing the majority of their child's care and education in the early years. Women then face unequal parenting and work opportunities, making it more difficult for them to advance themselves and their children. And of course, these factors are not independent. So gender discrimination is often compounded by poverty, and good childcare can really alleviate poverty, both in the short term by freeing up parental time for work, but also in the long term via better educational outcomes. And this can be sort of nicely seen in the CRC concluding observations for Cameroon in 2017, where the committee recommends the state parties strengthen the strategies and measures for fulfilling children's rights to poverty reduction initiatives, in particular by establishing a universal childcare benefit. However, as I showed earlier in that graph, these are not the only areas of discrimination, and they're not the only points of intersection. The thing is that the right to equality is also a key part of these conventions. As you can see in these quotes, the conventions state that the rights must be guaranteed without discrimination. And because ECCE is often available to the more privileged in society, the right to equality really requires the immediate extension of this right to all children. So we've kind of argued that we think this is potentially quite a powerful source of redress for the most marginalized children, because even though the right to education is only progressively realizable, which means that the covenant recognizes that countries may be limited in their ability to provide education by things like available resources. Whereas on the other hand, the right to equality is immediately realizable, which means that if there is any provision at all, it must be accessible without discrimination. And we've argued in more detail in this paper that is just about to come out, how we might go about using the right to equality to argue for immediate access to ECCE. So kind of what I've gone over is that although ECC is not expressly mentioned in the above mentioned human rights conventions, we believe that it is clear that it is an implicit part of the right to education, survival and development. As is often the case, it's the most vulnerable who face the greatest challenges to access and quality, perpetuating their vulnerability. And the right to equality, we think, could maybe be used to address the gaps in provision in ECCE. So thanks for listening, and I will hand over. Let me stop sharing my screen. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Georgie, for that very comprehensive presentation. Please can I remind everybody to keep putting questions into the Q&A because we will have time afterwards to discuss these amongst our panel and between the members of our panel themselves. So we are now moving on. We've been discussing so far international level, but we also talked a bit about how the right to equality, etc., could be used at a domestic level within different countries. Now we're going to hand over to Nerina Ali, who's currently at the University of Cape Town, but has been, as I said, at the forefront of strategic litigation on the right to education, previously in her role at the head of the law center, the Equal Education Law Center, which made huge progress on the right to education in South African courts and elsewhere. So thank you so much, Nerina, for joining us, and over to you for 10 minutes.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sandy. Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be part of the discussion today. I'm very grateful for the invitation. And Sandy has been very kind by saying that I played a role in litigation around basic education, but there are people in the room today who have far more experience than I, particularly on the question of early childhood education. So I'm very pleased to have them part of the conversation as well. So my focus is going to be on South Africa specifically, hopefully using it as a case study for thinking about the role of strategic litigation at the domestic level and how international rights instruments can play a role in strategic litigation. So just some high-level background on the state of early childhood care and education provisioning in South Africa. 35%, only 35% of 0 to 5-year-olds access ECD programs in the country. Importantly, access for 4 to 5-year-olds is significantly higher, although even in that case, the quality of the ECD programs that the children are accessing is, to put it mildly, questionable at best. So the levels of access and adequacy is significantly lower than it should be. Only 13% of the poorest children in the country benefit from state-subsidized ECD programs. And given the levels of poverty in the country, that is nothing short of a crisis. And only 57% of children, 57% of children, that's more than half, do not meet expected early learning and physical growth standards for their age. So in summary, the current picture of early childhood provisioning in the country is really dire. While there have been some strides since the end of apartheid, there's significantly more work that needs to be done. So given this context, what are the sorts of interventions that can make a difference? Well, the country over the past 25 years has had significant civil society activism, as well as strategic litigation in relation to the right to basic education. The South African Constitution is exceptionally generous when it comes to the right to basic education. It's an unqualified, immediately realizable right. And so it has provided very fruitful ground for developing jurisprudence on the right to basic education. And there are a range of organizations who have worked on these issues for many years, and a combination of activism and law to try and make some gains in advancing equality and equity in basic education. From the jurisprudential perspective, strategic litigators have used various cases to develop the components of the right to basic education, to include, for example, furniture, stationery, nutrition, basic infrastructure, which over time the courts have come to recognize as being necessary for a basic education. And so this has been very fruitful. Again, there are many areas where there could be further development, but one can at least see some progress in using litigation to at least develop the content of the right and to some extent see some gains on the ground. But what about litigation in respect of early childhood care and education or development? Well, despite the very vibrant environment for litigation and activism around the right to basic education, until very recently, there had not been as much activism or litigation in relation to early childhood care and education. That is not to say that there hasn't been many organizations who have been advocating around these issues or involved in early childhood care and education. There have been many organizations and many individuals who have done significant work over the years. However, there has been a sense where the early childhood development sector has not been as oppositional in relation to government policies, and has not been as coordinated in relation to campaigns as compared to basic education. But a significant turning point, I suggest, was reached during the COVID-19 crisis. During this period, early childhood development providers were really devastated by the impact of the pandemic and also by the impact of government policies. Early childhood development programs were closed down indefinitely. There was not a lot of communication from the state on when these programs would be opened. In the interim, ECD providers were not earning an income. There was uncertainty about whether or not they would be able to open after the lockdown had been pulled back. And so the sector was really devastated by the crisis. And it was in this stage, out of necessity, that we saw some organizations and some collectives starting to use litigation in order to secure some accountability from government for their planning and to ensure that the ECD sector could survive, that children could have access to services, and that providers could continue providing those services. So there were two cases that were actually launched in this period. And what's significant is that this is against a background where for a very long time, there had not really been any litigation in relation to early childhood development. And the two cases focused on two main things. The first was to actually reopen the sector, given that government had shut down all ECD providers during the initial stages of the pandemic and had not given clarity on when they would reopen. And that case was successful in that the government was required to reopen the sector and allow ECD providers to continue to function, which had a significant impact on access for children. The second case was about litigating to keep the sector open. Because of the pandemic and the lockdown, government had adjusted its policies in relation to the payment of subsidies to ECD providers, had stopped paying portions of the subsidy to ECD providers, and this was threatening the sustainability and very existence of the sector. The initial court case was successful in the lower court. However, it was overturned on appeal. Nonetheless, despite this, both cases, I think, represented a very promising willingness by stakeholders in the sector, as well as courts, to use the available mechanisms in the Constitution and law to secure accountability for ECD provisioning. So that represented, I would suggest, a very promising step. However, these cases were launched in a very difficult, exceptional set of circumstances. They were brought on an urgent basis with not a lot of time to develop the legal arguments or the factual basis for the cases. And ultimately, they were quite reactive. They were responding to a situation of crisis. So while there were some positive aspects to the way in which these cases were brought, they could have potentially developed aspects of the law further if more time had been invested or could have been invested in developing the litigation. So now that we've had a kind of initial use of the courts in relation to ECD, what are some of the lessons or what are some of the reflections for future directions? Well, the first I would suggest is the importance of a strategic approach, not simply using litigation in response to situations that may arise in an ad hoc way, but really developing and building a proactive strategy that is ultimately aimed at developing a holistic ECD rights-based jurisprudence. In the cases, in the judgments that we saw, the courts demonstrated great sympathy with the plight of the children and the providers in those cases. But ultimately, the legal reasoning or the rights basis for the relief was very thin, where there isn't really a reliance on a well-developed sense of a right to early childhood care and education. Instead, the courts relied on the best interests of the child or otherwise relied on the right to nutrition, for example. So here, and this is building on Georgina's presentation, there's significant role for international law and for litigators to rely on international law to develop that rights-based foundation. And then finally, there's also growing opportunities for combining litigation with broader social mobilization strategies and learning here from the experience in the basic education sector. So there's South African experience to draw from. There's inspiration from elsewhere. Brazil offers a very good example of the combination of activism and litigation for early childhood development. And in South Africa, we're now seeing very robust, vibrant, emerging campaigns that are really trying to develop multifaceted or multi-pronged approaches to advancing the right to early childhood development. I see Sandy on my screen, so I'll end there. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Narina, for that really interesting presentation. And there are some questions which we will come back to in due course at the end of the session. So what we've done now is we've surveyed what human rights law can provide at international level and at domestic level through strategic litigation in South Africa in particular. We're going to now turn to B. Shepherd from Human Rights Watch, who has been at the forefront of a different approach, which is to seek to actually amend international human rights law to achieve an explicit right to early childhood education. The exact wording of it is itself an issue. And for that, I'll now turn over to you, B. Thank you.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. So I guess the question is, if the panelists here today, including me, and as well, I suspect many of you who have joined this webinar, all believe that the right to education includes, or at least should include, early childhood education, then why do we even need to have this webinar? Well, it's, as Georgina presented at the beginning, it's because it's just not explicit, at least at the international law level, that this is so. It's because it's not clearly spelled out in black and white in international law. So I'm going to use my time today to ask, well, what if we could change that? How could we make early childhood education an explicit right under international law? And what might be the benefits of doing so? So first, let's talk about how we could change it. How could we make it clear under international law that early childhood education is every child's right? Well, we at Human Rights Watch believe that the strongest way to do this would be through a new treaty. So as many of you know, a treaty is like a contract, but whereas a contract is made perhaps between two people or between you and a company, say your telephone company or your internet provider, which contains legally binding provisions that both sides must follow, a treaty is an agreement between countries where they are legally obliged to follow the provisions within. One treaty that we've heard about today from Georgina is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Many of you will have heard of it before today as well. It's a treaty that every country on the planet, with the exception of the United States, has agreed to be bound to follow. And as Professor Fredman mentioned, in this treaty and in some other countries, countries have agreed that all children have a right to education. And specifically, these treaties guarantee that all children are entitled to free primary education. Now, one thing that I find interesting about the Convention on the Rights of the Child is that since it was agreed upon back in 1989, there have been 3 new treaties that have sought to improve upon or update or upgrade this original treaty. And they've sought to increase the kinds of protections afforded to children. These new treaties are known as optional protocols. One of these optional protocols raised the age at which children could be recruited into countries' armed forces. And this was because there was a sense that the original treaty had set the age too low at 15. A second optional protocol went into more details about what countries could do to protect children from sexual exploitation, because it was felt that the original Convention on the Rights of the Child wasn't clear enough about what countries should be doing to stop this. And a third optional protocol gives children the option of taking a complaint to an international committee if they feel that their rights are being violated in their home countries. And that was because it was felt that the original Convention on the Rights of the Child was not adequately giving children an opportunity to ask for their rights to be enforced. So this could be a similar case. It's Human Rights Watch's position that the original treaty, the original Convention on the Rights of the Child, created more than 32 years ago in admittedly different times, set the definition of the right to education too low, too unambitiously. And so a 4th optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child could fix this by explicitly saying that the right to education includes a right to early childhood education. We also think that a new optional protocol could similarly go into more details about what the right to early childhood education actually means. For example, we would advocate that it should explicitly say that children have a right to at least 1 year of free pre-primary education, and perhaps more. And just a side note, we at Human Rights Watch also think that such a fourth optional protocol could be used to explicitly guarantee all children an immediate right to free secondary education as well, because that's another gap that we see in the explicit language of the treaties that we think could do with a fix or an upgrade. So this new treaty could guarantee free education from pre-primary through to secondary education. Because let's face it, as you all know, children today need both pre-primary and secondary education if they're going to be able to survive and thrive in today's world. Now, getting a new treaty is not easy. It takes years. I'll give you some examples. The process for the first 2 optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child took approximately 6 years each. The 3rd optional protocol took 2 years. Once adopted, however, new international law can accelerate far-reaching changes in national law, national policy, and national practice. I'll give you 2 examples. In the decade following the adoption of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child that I mentioned, the one about raising the age of recruitment into national armed forces, nearly 20 countries adopted or amended their own national legislation to raise the minimum age of voluntary recruitment to at least 18 years old. Another treaty that we at Human Rights Watch worked to encourage countries to adopt was a treaty about decent work for domestic workers. And since that treaty was adopted back in 2011, more than 70 countries have strengthened labor protections for domestic workers, which has been improving the lives of millions of people. New treaty law brings about concrete change. And that's in part because clearly articulated rights in international law can become a tool for parents when they're banging on the front door of the preschool, demanding that their children are entitled to enter for free. It's a tool that advocates for children, like yourselves, can use to pressure your own governments to deliver on these promises. It's a tool that lawyers like Narina, who you just heard from, can point at when she goes into court and wants to convince judges that this is the law. And it's a tool that international experts like Raji, who you're about to hear from, can use so as to ask governments and press them, what are you doing to make this a reality? The good news is, difficult though it is, we also think that a new treaty is achievable. Here's why. Based on our research, we believe that about half of all countries already guarantee 1 or more years of free pre-primary education. That means that there's a large group of countries that would be ready to sign a new treaty on day 1. And in fact, all countries have already made a political commitment. That's more like a promise rather than a legally binding commitment, but they made a political promise to guarantee access to pre-primary education as part of something which is known as the Sustainable Development Goals. So a new treaty would give countries the opportunity to back up these commitments with binding international law. We would be essentially just holding countries to their word. And finally, we have seen some countries are beginning to express interest in this idea. There was a big United Nations education conference held in New York in September of last year. And at that conference, Argentina and Spain made national commitments to support the expansion of the right to education under international law. And at another UN conference on early childhood education held last year in November, Bangladesh and Iceland committed to strengthening international law on preschool education. And indeed, in recent months, Human Rights Watch has met with dozens of countries, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. So if you're listening to this, and you think this might be the kind of initiative that your own government might be interested in supporting, please drop me a line. I'm going to put my email in the chat box, because I would love to connect with you to discuss how you could ask them to do just that. Because although it's countries who ultimately write international treaties, it's countries who make international law, they are more likely to do so if they are hearing from their citizens and they're hearing from civil society organizations in their countries that they believe that it's an important thing for them to do. So to conclude and to keep it simple, yes, it's not easy to create new human rights treaties. But in this case, we think that it can be done. And since we think it would be to the benefit of millions of children, we think that it's more than worth the effort required. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bede, for that really helpful and informative account of how we might and why we might go about actually amending international human rights law, which complements what the actual practice of human rights monitoring committees, which Georgie showed in her presentation, and Nerina at domestic level as to how we can litigate that. So please do put your questions into the Q&A. As I said, we will have a panel discussion at the end. We're going to turn now to Raji, who's going to talk to us about the Right to Education Initiative and global advocacy for human rights, drawing all of these different approaches together. So over to you, Raji.
Thank you, Sandy, and hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Hello.
can.
Yeah, thank you. I represent my organization, the Right to Education Initiative, and Right to Education Initiative is a global human rights organization. And we work for the realization of right to education without any discrimination. And ECCE being one of our major areas, we focus on ECCE for various purposes. So why we are focusing on this issue? As we all know, ECCE is fundamental to the education systems, yet some 35 million children of the world do not have access to pre-primary education. And there is an inadequate public investment and legal guarantees. And also, like Bede has explained, it lacks explicit reference in the international human rights law. And also, this inequalities in access and quality, it affects the most vulnerable. And in that context, what are the two changes, main changes that we want to see, and why do we do this international advocacy? The one change that we want to really see is to strengthen, sorry. Hello.
Hi, Raji.
Go ahead.
Hear you.
Yeah.
We can see.
Continue.
Yeah. One of the main change that we want to see is to strengthen the international law, especially the ECCE dimensions in the international law, which is similar to what Bede has already presented. And the second changes that what we envision also similar to the previous presentations, adoption and implementation and enforcement of laws at the national level. And in that context, what are our advocacy objectives? And actually, I break it here for a better understanding on how we take this approach in different ways. Like I said, the first thing is the explicit reference of ECCE rights in international law. We could start with a soft law, maybe a guidelines, or it could be a general comment, or it could be the revision of general comment, or it could be an optional protocol like how my previous speaker Bede has explained, or it could be a new treaty on the evolving right to education dimension. And the second main objective for us is also, we want states to be accountable. Accountable in the sense they adopt laws and policies at national level and do an effective implementation. So what we believe is this international advocacy is, when we do international advocacy, it's not just at the international level, but it should be parallelly done at the national level. So that way it is reinforcing in both ways. And our main goals here is to get country-specific recommendations from the treaty bodies, and also to include country-specific case stories as well as best practices, which can be a learning for others. In order to achieve this too, we believe the intergovernmental organizations have to play a lead role. While there are many that includes other organizations like World Bank, we focus initially with these organizations, with the Human Rights Council, for example. They should include ECC in their resolution on right to education. And we want special rapporteurs to cover the issue of ECC in their reports. We want states to champion ECCE so that it becomes discussed and then it progresses. And also we want UNESCO to look into the human rights dimension of ECC into their programs, statements, political forums, etc. Like I said earlier, we believe in this process, a process that mutually reinforcing from local to the international level and international level to the local. While the reason why we do international advocacy is the ground reality. The children do not have access to ECCE, and that's the reason. And how the international dimension influences this changes. What we believe is by setting the human rights standards and by setting international benchmarks and re-emphasizing on the state obligations to make ECCE as a public provision, we could address these changes. So that's what we believe in. And we take a three-pronged approach. In order to achieve these changes, we take a three-pronged approach, where one of the main approach that we take is to influence intergovernmental organizations through constant engagement. Later, I'll give some examples of how we have done so far and what we have done so far, especially Human Rights Council, UN treaty bodies, and states, UN Special Rapporteur and UNESCO. These are the organizations we have been involved so far. And what we also believe is RTE cannot done this work. And we also always believe in a collective process, because international advocacy is a collective process. So what we did is we built a coalition and networking among the various actors. This include CSOs, academic researchers, partners, as well as representatives of states. And also we have representation from the UN forums, UNESCO, from the Office of UN Special Rapporteur. And the third approach, what we take is, while we do this focusing on the international dimension, we also focus at the national level. And the approach what we take at national level is, we want to encourage CSOs at the national level, as well as academic researchers at the national level, to take, to monitor ECCE from a human rights perspective. For that purpose, we develop tools and resources, and we build the capacities of CSOs and other interested parties. And here we take more of a country-specific approach. And some of our experiences that what we have done so far and what outcome we have achieved includes, we have mainly worked with UNESCO, mainly to re-emphasize or to include the agenda of legal framework on ECCE. Some of the specific examples include, we worked together with them as a partners in the Global Partnership Strategy for Early Childhood, where we worked for the inclusion of normative framework as one of the main 5 goals. And also we initiated a collective process, a collective advocacy, global advocacy collective, where Sandy is involved, again, BEAD is involved, a process where it led to the development of a thematic document that focuses on the strengthening legal framework, the dimension of legal framework. And also this collective, together with UNESCO, organized a parallel event at the Second World Conference on building and strengthening the legal framework on ECCE rights. All this process contributed for securing a reference to the need for a strong legal framework in the Tashkent Declaration. The other example that what we have worked is what worked out for us is we worked in persistently with the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education. Whatever theme the report focuses on, we included the ECCE dimension. We also engaged with the Special Rapporteur at different forums that also contributed to the report, a specific report on ECCE. And we also engaged with few states. We worked for the inclusion of ECCE in the Human Rights Resolution in 2021, where we worked with UNESCO so that it got included. And also we organized joint webinars. And like I said earlier, we have established a global advocacy working group that focuses, that leads this work at the moment. And this group also envisions a guidelines on ECCE. And at the end, this is another approach that what we take is the country-specific approach, where so far we have worked with partners in Peru, Guatemala, and also in Argentina. And I'm glad to inform you that when we worked with Peru, the Committee on the Rights of the Child also included ECCE in the list of issues that the government should address. And if anyone interested to work with us at a country level on monitoring ECCE, we'll be happy to work with you. And I thank the organizers for this opportunity, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Raji. So now, after having had this very rich and interesting display of what's been going on at various levels, international and national, we turn to a panel discussion. As I've said before, please do continue to put in your questions and answers and into the Q&A, and thank you very much for that. I think putting some of the themes together in the questions, the first main one seems to be around what is the content of the right to early childhood care and education, particularly as the first set of questions is asking, are we only thinking about a pre-primary year, or are we thinking about ECE, ECD as starting from perhaps even birth or even prenatal, as one of our questioners is asking. So perhaps we could also have a few contributions from different panelists on this. Perhaps I could start with you, Nerina, on when you talk about litigating in South African courts, have you got a sense of the age range that the right to ECCE should be encompassing?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's one of the complexities of the right to early childhood development as compared to a more focused right on education specifically. One of the arguments that I've made together with two colleagues is that a broad right to development framing would encompass a holistic package of services that are necessary for development in the children's early years, which includes prenatal services. And so I think that framing of the right is also very important to understanding what the specific content would be. But my view is that when litigators and when advocacy organizations are thinking about this, it should be thinking about it as more broadly than just a few years prior to primary schooling.
And do you think in your strategic litigation that that's something which courts would be able to deal with, or would it be more desirable to have a circumscribed, an age issue? Irina?
To the extent that we're dealing specifically with pre-primary education. Well, I think courts would leave a lot of discretion to the state, but it is, if we take an understanding of the right to education as being about where the basic education needs are met, our courts have said that that's not necessarily age determined. That's more about whether or not specific thresholds for early learning or learning capacities or capabilities have been met. And so there is, I think, a promising move to not think about this specifically about in terms of ages, at least in the South African context.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Irina. So I think, Georgie, in our research, we found that the various monetary committees do tend to refer to quite a wide age range in terms of different countries in their recommendations to countries as how best to comply with the rights. So I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, there is a little bit of variability in the concluding observations as to whether they refer to kind of maybe between 2 and 3 as being an age where you should start providing, or but I think increasingly as you head towards more recent years, there seems to be a move towards a kind of more holistic policy starting from birth. I haven't seen anything stating that there should be anything provided prenatally, but there looks like there's definitely a move towards this idea of a holistic, which isn't necessarily kind of ironed out very often what they mean by holistic, but it seems to include things like nutritional intervention, childcare, all of these things within that, and very much starting from birth.
Thanks, Georgie. So, Bede, I think in your presentation, you very much focused on 1 or up to 2 years preschool. So I wondered why that decision has been made to only think of 1 or 2 years preschool rather than the range that we've heard from Georgie and Irina.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think the focus on 1 or 2 years of preschool was thinking about guaranteeing that be available to all children for free. But that doesn't mean that limits the scope of what the right to early childhood education includes. I think we would take the position that indeed the right to early childhood education does begin at least at birth, because the moment babies are here, they are beginning to do that learning. They're beginning to learn from their parents. They're learning emotions, they're learning language, they're learning motor skills from their parents. Parents are babies' first teachers. But as it gets, and I think that there are obligations on the governments to support that in some ways, or at least not interfere with that are part of the element of the right to early childhood education. But as we get increasing more towards community-based and community-aided and educator-aided education, and that's often when costs we have seen in countries around the world suddenly becomes a barrier to some children. And so explicitly guaranteeing not only that there's a right for all children to early childhood education, but there's a right to at least some degree of free early childhood education is about ensuring that all children have access to that kind of education as well. Because we know from all the research that being able to benefit from pre-primary education is such a equalizer amongst children who come from families of different economic backgrounds. But that only happens if they can afford to get through into the school door. But age is a tough one, I think, under international law. International law has left it kind of ambiguous for other areas of education too. It says, international treaties say we have a right to free and compulsory primary education, but the treaties don't say whether that starts at age 4 or age 5 or at age 6 or at age 7. And in fact, we see in practice around the world, there is a differing opinion by governments. It's just an ambiguity that's out there. Do I think that could be fixed by a new treaty. Sure, it could be fixed by a new treaty, but I think that states would be reluctant to, because they are often so set in their ways of when they believe primary education starts, when secondary education starts, when secondary education finishes. So I think the way to deal with that ambiguity and difference of practice would be to just reframe it as at least 1 year of free pre-primary education, that being the year before compulsory primary education starts. And a protocol could also suggest that countries come up with a plan for how they continue to expand access to free pre-primary education throughout early childhood education as their finances allow. But it's a good question. So one of the other questions I think Gil put in the Q&A was similarly about like whether that would have to be at a special ECD center. And I don't think that that's necessarily true either. I mean, I think the international law talks about there being a right to education. It doesn't talk about there being a right to schooling, or it doesn't suggest that you have to be in a certain kind of school to receive an education. And so I think there is room for ambiguity. It's about the children being able to access education rather than having to be in a certain kind of center or building.
Thank you. So yes, so that takes us on to the next theme of the questions as I see it, which is where this ECC takes place. Is it center-based? And even so one of the questions is strengthening parenting as part of the continuum, and this has become particularly important, and as Tom points out, post-COVID, where a lot of care is taking place in the home, but obviously, as Nerina said in her presentation, there's really a lot of informal care in South Africa, not in particular centres, etc. So I wondered whether our panelists could also say something about seeing the right to early childhood education as including support for parenting, including informal provision. And maybe you want to kick this one off, Raji.
Hi. In terms of parents, like in the thematic document that I mentioned, we have also included this aspect as part of the legal framework. And even if we take the General Comment 7, which already puts it, that also it clarifies the assistance the state has to provide to parents. But at the same time, having worked at a grassroots level as well, I disagree with the view of putting the responsibility on the parent, and the responsibility should lie on the state, while the state, as per the CRC, should provide the assistance. That's where I believe in. And when it is legally mandated, and I think that leads for implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Georgie, I think in the survey of all the concluding observations, etc., there was also some discussion of the way in which states should be using their resources, whether it's, again, part of this idea of how resources should be used. And I wonder whether you could say a little bit about that in terms of whether this should only take place in school settings or much more broadly within the community.
I mean, I think that they're not particularly prescriptive as far as I could see as to where these things should take place, but more that there should be and kind of that resources should be distributed so that there was equal access and provision to good quality for everyone. And this is particularly an issue, as I kind of pointed out, in rural versus urban, and in some more even further away kind of island communities, where it might be difficult for some people to access. And that the government should ensure that these resources are equally distributed. But in terms of whether it should be within a formal, informal education or within communities, I don't think that that's necessarily prescribed, as long as the government is making sure that that there is provision for these kids in one way or another.
Thanks. And maybe Narina, some of the work, as I understand it, that you've been doing is actually focusing on nutrition, which is seen to be quite central as on the package that the state should be providing. Sorry, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so as one component of the broader package of what children have a right to as part of their right to development is, of course, nutrition. And in South Africa, we're fortunate because there's a constitutional right that children have to basic nutrition. And like the right to basic education is immediately realizable. And so there's a lot of potential there to advance one aspect of the right to development. But again, I think the rights grounding for that, it's important to recognize that the right to nutrition is important and interconnected with other aspects of the right to development, including early learning, for example. And so there's a lot of, I think, important work to be done around rooting the right to nutrition in that broader framework.
Thank you. We have a question also from Sarah Klaus about the how rights can be structured to protect against what they call schoolification, and particularly talking about inclusion of children with special education needs under the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And in our paper too, Georgie, we did look at the question of inclusive education and how the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities has been approaching this in the early childhood period of life. Perhaps you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, sorry.
Georgie, I just wanted to let Sandy know, and after that, there are two people that unmuted Sandy who could ask their questions live, Lucy Minayo and Rebecca Hickman. But over to you, Georgie.
Okay. Yes, there's very much a focus on making sure that education, mainstream education, is inclusive. So although they talk about ECCE as well in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and they talk about making ECECE spaces inclusive, and rather than creating specialist education systems for people. And that's like quite broad in terms of they encompass people with all sorts of different special educational needs, be them physical, psychosocial, or anything that might require extra needs or any different kinds of needs.
Sorry, Shikufe, I didn't quite hear what you said.
Oh, Sandy, I just wanted to share that I've allowed two participants from the floor who would ask questions to maybe perhaps ask their questions live. So Lucy Minayo and Rebecca Hickman. So whenever you're ready we can request them to ask their questions live.
Yeah, go ahead, Lucy.
Maybe we can begin with Rebecca, as I see Lucy.
Okay, go on then.
Hi, thanks so much.
Could you put on your video, or if you don't want to, then don't, but it would be nice to see you too.
I'm not sure she can, but maybe I could promote her to a panelist and then she can.
Okay.
Rebecca, if you can share where you're calling from and yeah, just a little bit, and then ask your question.
That seemed to do a whole lot of chucking me out and letting me back in. Sorry about that. So yeah, I was curious, and I mean this idea of a guaranteed right to a year of pre-primary feels potentially like too narrow, but also too low hanging a fruit. In South Africa, which is where I work, the government would probably argue it's already achieved that in grade R, because it's couched its rollout of universal grade R as being its rollout of part of its rollout of 2 years of preschool education. So my other concern there, which is the larger one, is that actually it creates a set of moving goalposts, because it all depends on how you define the compulsory school starting age, or where your schools are, etc., etc. So effectively, in one country, you'd have children having the right to early learning much earlier than they would in other countries. Anyhow, so it sort of feels like, for me, it doesn't feel radical enough. And I was just wondering on panelists' views on that.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And I wonder whether we could also join that with one of the questions, which the very first question on our Q&A, which was in South Africa, since you talk about South Africa, what are the strategies, what are the good strategies which have increased access compared to most countries in Africa, which haven't? So is it, Nerina, perhaps you could start on this. Is 1 to 2 years preschool education a low-hanging fruit? And on the other side, from the South African perspective, why is it seen as a low-hanging fruit, in the sense that perhaps more progress has been made there than in other countries, neighboring countries?
Yeah, thanks. So Rebecca, I definitely agree with you. And thanks for making the point. I would also ask Bede, for example, why is the emphasis on creating a treaty on the right to early childhood education and not a more broader focus on early childhood development, particularly given the difficulties of getting a new treaty to begin with? Why not try to get the best ideal system from the outset? Again, I think the right to education framing has a lot of value. But we should perhaps consider whether a broader right to development framework could achieve some of the holistic connections, but better than maybe the right to education framework, and avoid some of the dangers of schoolification that were also raised in the comments. So I definitely see where Rebecca is coming from with that. On the other side, I found that question very enlightening, and it's also a bit eye-opening, because often in South Africa, we tend to be quite pessimistic about our situation and only see the negative. But in comparative perspective, there may be aspects of our provisioning that are better. It's probably mostly in the ages 4 to 5. But again, and Rebecca probably could speak more to this, but there is maybe a good indicators on access, still not as good as it should be, but the quality of provisioning is really not where it should be. And so we should also be careful about just looking at the numbers and think we're seeing success, and really consider more carefully what our indicators of success are.
So do you want to come back on the first part of Nerina's answer, Bede?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think it's a really good challenge. I mean, to me, it doesn't feel radical enough, as you put it. However, we also have to face the process of how international law is made, and that is that it is agreed to by states, and it is not agreed to by what I want it to be, or what any of us on this call might want it to be. And so states are more likely to agree to a standard that they find is within their grasp, or which they feel is something that they already comply with. That's how you get lots of states to sort of agree to something, is if they feel that it's not going to increase the cost on them. So if we look at practice around the world, we think that it's just less than half of all countries now provide at least 1 year of pre-primary education. And I agree with your critique that that is tough for some countries, because for some, we're talking about kids who are they're providing pre-primary to kids who are 4 before they start compulsory schooling at 5. And some we're talking about providing education to kids who are 6 because they start compulsory education at 7, but that they're calling that their pre-primary year. So if we've got about half of all countries that have already sort of agreed to at least that as a standard, then that seems like an achievable level that you could get enough, a sufficient mass of states to agree to sort of to make this step into new international law. And I think it's then incumbent upon finding a language that also says, hey, but that's just the beginning, it's not the end. And there are ways that you could do that, and sort of there's language that you could borrow from the, not to get too technical, but the original Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights, where you could say, but you also have to come up with a plan about how you're going to continue to expand access to free early childhood education, and then, you know, however expansive you want to define that. But to get enough states to agree to it for it to actually become law, it needs to be something which they feel like is within their grasp.
Thanks, Peter. So should we turn to you then, Lucy? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And this has been such an interesting conversation. I am the director of the Home-Based Childcare Initiative. I have a legal background. I'm a lawyer from Kenya. And so this is really bringing things back home for me. So my questions were really about home-based childcare. And I'm very curious to hear from some of the panelists about how would you frame the right to education in the context of childcare? And childcare, thinking specifically about children aged 0 to 3, a majority of whom in the global south are being taken care of in homes by childcare providers that are inadequately trained, under-resourced, etc. So how would the framing for that look like? And I'm asking this question because I've looked at several pieces of legislation that define the right to education. And as you all have noted, basic education is defined in a restricted manner, and I think it's very strategic for governments because it defines then the investments that they begin to make. And in this country, they only recently started to make investments from age 4 onwards. So very simply, how do you define, how would we be looking at the right to education in the context of home-based childcare or children that are taken care of at home that are aged 0 to 3?
Thank you very much, Lucy. Perhaps would you like to kick off on this, Raji?
Thanks, Lucy, for your question. See, I would relate it with, equal to right to education, equal to right to development as well. From that aspect, like just to give one example, if the children are dying of malnutrition, if the children are, if they do not have capabilities to learn effectively because of lack of nutrition, that affects. I think that's how we have this framework, ECCE framework. It's an integrated approach, and that's what most of us believe in. ECCE cannot be just looked from only from an education point of view, and that's where even educational approaches, including the playway method and other aspects, are included. It includes, in my point of view, it includes nutrition, it includes healthcare, preventive healthcare, and also it includes protection, which is very much important, where a child is protected. And also it includes parental care, parental love and concern, and also other playway opportunities. So that's how I would frame right to education at an early childhood care and age. And I strongly believe it includes from 0 to whatever age the country defines, although the international definition says 8, and 0, it also includes pregnant women carrying while the child is at mother's womb. Thank you.
Thanks, Raji. So there is some evidence in this from the including observations, the recommendations of the monitoring committees. Georgie, would you like to come in on what the actual practice is in terms of how widely or how holistically the committees are approaching early childhood in terms of education?
Do you mean in terms of including things like nutrition and facilities and things like that? Yeah, so these are all considered so quality is, I think, a massive aspect, which I think you pointed out, Lucy, is that it's not really just about provision, but also about the quality of provision. And that's something which is focused on a lot. On what quality encompasses then is, as Raji was saying, is all of these other aspects such as sanitation and nutrition and adequate facilities, and those all have to be included regardless of the where this is going to actually be taking place. Also in terms of training, so one of the things that that they drive home is the need to provide obviously adequate facilities, but also resources in terms of human resources. So to make sure that there is adequate training for people who are providing care, whether it be more formal sort of education or whether it's sort of a broader and younger childcare, that people who are providing it should be properly trained and qualified. And I guess this also feeds into broader questions about parenting support, and also about good education for your citizens, so that they grow up better able to look after the next generation.
Thanks, Georgie. So, I mean, in fact, when there is already quite a lot of commitment in international human rights law to this holistic view, which could be used strategically by civil society on the ground to achieve that accountability, which we've all been talking about. So although we could talk about how we should frame the right to early childhood education, it has already been framed in quite a holistic way, according to the practice of the committees. And one of the aims of this webinar is really to bring that to the attention of people who are working on the ground, so they can draw on it for holding their governments to account on the ground. So I wonder whether we could, maybe as one of our last questions, turn to you, Nathan, because you, I see on the video as well, and maybe you want to ask your question in person too about resources, which is going to be the key crunch point, and how we hold states accountable for the provision of resources. So do you want to come in then, Nathan, with your questions, particularly about percentage of GDP, which is a very interesting thought?
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and thank you for the panelists. In light of some of the aspects of early childhood development and education, particularly prenatal and postnatal aspects of childcare and quality, capacity building, and all that, if any of the panelists have had chance to analyze the right in terms of a percentage allotment to early childhood development, percentage allotment of the GDP, rather than maybe particularly sticking to a 1 year or 2 year of early childhood education. If there has been any chance, it would be really nice to hear from you guys. Thank you very much.
Okay, so do you feel this is something that you could put before courts in South Africa in terms of strategic litigation, to say openly you are not putting enough resources into this sector, and you should be? Or is this more of a political strategy in your view?
Well, I think Sandy, you and Georgina have made a very good argument for how this is an argument that we could put forward in the South African courts, given our particular constitutional context and framing. And so I think there certainly is a need, when thinking about litigating socioeconomic rights and the right to early childhood development, to ensure that governments can be held accountable for their resource allocation. But I would say that this has to be in combination with broader social mobilization, broader activism that maintains the pressure on government, and that also does a lot of the important work around working with government where necessary to try and find solutions and think about the systemic implications of sometimes taking some of these issues to court and the resource implications that go with it.
Thank you. And yeah, and as you said, in our research, we did find quite, and I think Georgie in her slide, in her PowerPoint did show that there was quite a strong emphasis from all of the human rights monitoring committees on the need to provide sufficient resources, both human capital and infrastructure. And as Georgie just said in her previous answer, including sanitation, nutrition, and so on. So again, from an international level, there is already something to draw on in domestic advocacy, whether or not that can be used through courts or in other forms, is a question which maybe all of the participants here would know for themselves as to what might be worthwhile. So I think because we're coming to the end of our seminar, I wonder whether the panelists could, just as a final word, everybody say something about what they would regard as maybe one take-home message that they would like to share with all the participants about using human rights law, whether internationally or domestically, to further ECCE. Should we start with you, Beed?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would say that obviously I work for a human rights organization. I believe, passionately about the role that, human rights standards can play, but I also feel that they're often just a tool, and they are a tool that are effective only when they are used by people, when they're used by civil society organizations, when they're used by advocates. And so we can't rely just on there being standards that government set. We should be pushing for standards that we believe are appropriate for what children deserve, and we believe children are entitled to, so that they can thrive in our world today. And just to reiterate my plan, my point that if you think that you'd like to be pushing your government to support an initiative for a new treaty law on this, I did put my email in the chat box, and please feel free to contact me. Thank you
Thank you. Raji, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. I would like to emphasize on the need for collaboration and collective effort that from national to global, as well as from the actors from the various walks of life. I think that would bring a lot of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie.
Yeah, just that it is quite extraordinary how much there is in international law already that it can be used to kind of push forward the agenda for ECCE, and that there are lots of interesting ways in which, as Raji said, through the different organizations and different levels of activity in society, we can maybe try and push this through and utilize that.
Thank you. And last word to you, Nerina.
Yeah, just to echo, I think it's really wonderful to see how generative the current conversations are around these issues. And I think the time has really come for a move forward. And I would say to try and be as radical as possible. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to our panel. Thanks to all of our participants. And what we really hope is this is only one step in an ongoing interaction, so that we can create this collaboration that Raji talked about. We can make use of the very rich resources available in human rights law, and we can continue to share best practice, so that by putting it all together, we can achieve even more together. Should I hand over to you, Shikupe, to end?
No, that's great, Sandy. Thank you so much to everyone, and we'll be sharing the recording as well as a PDF of the presentations. I know a lot of people have asked that question. So thank you, everyone, and thank you to the panelists and Sandy, and as well as the ECTAN team for supporting the organization, and Baram, who's also online, has been coordinating as well. So thank you, everyone, and wishing you all a wonderful morning, afternoon, and evening.
Thank you very much, and goodbye to everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for
Bye. Bye.
organizing.